The most important text of his life looked like a joke when it appeared on his screen. The soft hum of a second-hand nebulizer filled the tiny apartment like a tired heartbeat. Emily Carter sat cross-legged on the worn carpet beside an aging gray sofa, one hand wrapped around a chipped coffee mug that had long gone cold. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the apartment window. Inside, the glow of a single lamp painted long shadows across the room. Her 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, lay curled beneath a faded pink blanket, her small chest rising and falling while the machine beside her released a gentle mist into the air. Emily glanced at the clock on the microwave. 10:47 p.m. Another late night. Another shift completed. Another stack of bills waiting on the kitchen counter. She rubbed her tired eyes and tried to ignore the knot growing in her stomach. Rent was due in 6 days. Sophie's prescription refill was due in 3. And her checking account balance was currently less than $50. The apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic hiss of the nebulizer and the occasional vibration of her phone resting on the coffee table. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to simply sit there and breathe. The exhaustion felt heavier than usual tonight. Maybe because she'd worked 10 hours straight at the cafe before rushing to pick Sophie up from after-school care. Maybe because she'd spent half the afternoon arguing with an insurance company representative who seemed more interested in policy numbers than children. Or maybe because she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her how she was doing and genuinely wanted the answer. Her phone lit up again. A message from her best friend, Rachel. "You survived today?" Emily laughed softly. "Barely." She unlocked her phone and stared at the screen. Rachel had been her closest friend since college. The only person who knew every messy detail of her life. The only person who could still make her smile after days like this. Emily typed quickly, "If you don't take me out for coffee tomorrow, I might actually fall in love with you." A small grin appeared on her face. It was the kind of joke they had exchanged for years. Harmless. Familiar. A tiny moment of lightness at the end of a difficult day. Without thinking, she hit send. Then she tossed her phone onto the couch and walked over to check on Sophie. The little girl shifted slightly beneath the blanket. Emily brushed a strand of blonde hair from her daughter's forehead and smiled. "You're doing okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just keep resting." A few moments later, her phone vibrated. Emily glanced over casually, then froze. Her smile disappeared. Slowly, she picked up the device. Her pulse quickened. Her eyes widened. The message wasn't from Rachel. It wasn't even close. The text conversation displayed a name she recognized instantly. Alexander Hayes, CEO, Hayes Technologies. Her boss's boss's boss. One of the most powerful business executives in Chicago. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers trembled as she opened the thread. Somehow, while scrolling through recent contacts earlier that week, she had accidentally selected Alexander Hayes's direct number instead of Rachel's. And now the message sat there in black and white. "If you don't take me out for coffee tomorrow, I might actually fall in love with you." "No," Emily whispered. "No, no, no." Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it. She immediately began typing an apology. But before she could send it, another vibration interrupted her. A reply had arrived. Emily stared at the screen. For several seconds, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. Finally, she read the message. "That's quite a dangerous text to send your billionaire boss at 10:47 at night." Across the city, 42 floors above Michigan Avenue, Alexander Hayes sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by projections, financial reports, and acquisition documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet despite the room full of executives waiting for his decision, his attention remained fixed on a single message glowing on his phone. And what neither Emily nor anyone else knew was that another image had arrived with that text by accident. A photograph attached automatically from her gallery. A simple picture showing a sleeping little girl on an old sofa, a nebulizer beside her. And something about that image made it impossible for Alexander Hayes to look away. The rain continued tapping softly against the apartment window while Emily stared at her phone as if it had suddenly become a live grenade in her hands. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. Her heart refused to slow down. Alexander Hayes. Out of every person in Chicago, somehow she had accidentally sent that message to Alexander Hayes. The billionaire founder whose name appeared in business magazines. The executive whose decisions affected thousands of employees. The man she had only seen from a distance during company events. Emily quickly typed a response. I am so sorry. That message was meant for my best friend. Please ignore it. I cannot believe I just did that. She hit send immediately. For a moment, nothing happened. Then another message appeared. Relax, Emily. I figured that much. She blinked. The reply felt strangely normal. Almost friendly. Not at all what she expected from one of the most powerful men in the city. Before she could decide whether to respond again, a soft cough came from the sofa. Emily's attention snapped back to Sophie. The little girl shifted beneath the blanket. Her breathing sounded slightly heavier than before. Emily immediately set down the phone and moved beside her daughter. Years of experience had taught her to notice every small change, every unusual sound, every subtle sign. She checked Sophie's temperature again. 101.8 degrees. Higher than earlier. Emily swallowed hard. The pediatrician had warned her that respiratory flare-ups could happen quickly. She adjusted the blanket and checked the nebulizer tubing. Everything seemed to be working properly, but an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Her phone vibrated once more. Alexander had sent another message. Is your daughter okay? Emily stared at the screen. Then her eyes moved to the photo attachment she had accidentally sent. Of course. He had seen Sophie. She hesitated before replying. She will be okay. Just another rough night. Alexander's response appeared almost immediately. Asthma. Emily frowned. Not exactly. Chronic respiratory issues. We are still trying to get answers. Several seconds passed. Then another message arrived. How old is she? 5. There was no reply after that. The conversation simply stopped. Emily assumed the CEO had finally returned to whatever important billion-dollar responsibilities filled his evenings. She set her phone aside and focused entirely on Sophie. Across downtown Chicago, Alexander Hayes sat motionless while the boardroom continued discussing acquisition projections. Voices filled the room. Charts changed on the screen. Numbers moved across financial reports. Yet Alexander heard almost none of it. His attention remained fixed on the photograph. The little girl sleeping beside the nebulizer. The image pulled him backward through time without warning. 15 years backward. To another rainy night. To another apartment. To another child fighting for breath. His younger sister, Claire. He remembered the machine beside her bed. He remembered the worried look on his mother's face. He remembered hospital visits becoming routine. And most of all, he remembered the helplessness. The feeling that no amount of determination could protect someone you loved from suffering. Alexander slowly looked away from the phone. He had spent years building companies. Years chasing success. Years convincing himself that the past belonged in the past. Yet one accidental photograph had reopened a door he thought had been permanently sealed. Mr. Hayes, one executive finally asked, "Are you ready to vote?" Alexander blinked. The entire room was looking at him. He straightened slightly. "Give me 5 minutes." The room fell silent. No one questioned him. They never did. Alexander stepped out into the hallway overlooking the city skyline. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness below. He unlocked his phone again. Something about the situation bothered him. Not because of the mistaken message. Not because of the awkward conversation. Because of the exhaustion he had seen in Emily's eyes through the reflection on the television screen behind her daughter. He recognized that look. The look of someone carrying too much for too long. Without realizing it, he opened Emily's employee file. Single mother. Customer support department. For years with the company. Excellent performance reviews. No disciplinary history. Consistently declined overtime promotions requiring travel. Emergency contact listed as Rachel Morgan. No spouse. No family members nearby. Alexander read the information twice. Then he checked the time. 10:59 p.m. Most people would have ended the conversation there. Most people would have wished her well and returned to business. Yet something continued pulling at him. Back in the apartment, Emily helped Sophie sit upright for another breathing treatment. The little girl opened sleepy blue eyes. "Mom," she whispered. "I am right here, sweetheart." Sophie managed a small smile before leaning against her shoulder. Emily kissed the top of her daughter's head and tried to ignore the growing worry inside her. Then her phone suddenly lit up again. A new message from Alexander Hayes appeared on the screen. It contained only 7 words. "Is she breathing worse than earlier tonight?" Emily looked down at Sophie before answering. The little girl rested against her shoulder, her breathing steady for the moment, but noticeably more labored than it had been earlier that evening. Emily hesitated. She did not know why she felt comfortable being honest with a man she had never actually met. Maybe because it was late. Maybe because she was tired. Or maybe because pretending everything was fine required more energy than she had left. Finally, she typed. A little worse. But the treatments usually help. I am keeping an eye on her. The typing indicator appeared almost instantly. Has she seen a specialist recently? Emily exhaled slowly. Not in 6 months. Insurance issues. The words looked heavier on the screen than they did in her head. She hated admitting things like that. Hated feeling as though she was failing her daughter. Alexander did not reply right away. Minutes passed. Emily assumed the conversation was over. She carried Sophie back to the sofa and tucked the blanket around her. The rain outside had grown heavier now. Water streamed down the glass in long silver trails. Somewhere in the building a door closed. Pipes rattled. Softly behind the walls. The apartment felt smaller than usual tonight. More isolated. More fragile. Her phone vibrated again. What hospital do you usually use? Emily frowned. Why? Just curious. Emily stared at the message. Most people stopped asking questions long before this point. Most people offered polite sympathy and moved on with their lives. Yet Alexander Hayes kept asking. Mercy Children's Hospital. Another pause followed. Then nothing. Emily checked the clock. 11:12 p.m. She shook her head and placed the phone face down on the coffee table. Whatever strange conversation this had become, it was time to let it end. She needed to focus on Sophie. 20 minutes later, the apartment had gone completely quiet. Sophie had fallen asleep again. The nebulizer treatment was finished. Emily sat at the kitchen counter sorting through unopened envelopes under the yellow glow of a ceiling light. Medical bills. Utility notices. Prescription receipts. Numbers. Endless numbers. She rubbed her forehead. Sometimes it felt like her entire life was measured in due dates. Then a sudden cough broke the silence. Emily looked up immediately. Sophie sat halfway upright on the sofa. Her small face looked pale. Emily rushed over. Hey, sweetheart. Sophie tried to smile, but another cough interrupted her. Emily gently touched her forehead. The fever felt hotter now. Much hotter. Anxiety tightened in her chest. She reached for the thermometer. 103.1. Her stomach dropped. She immediately checked Sophie's breathing again. The little girl leaned heavily against her. Mommy, Sophie whispered. I feel tired. Emily forced a calm smile she did not feel. I know, sweetheart. Just stay with me. She grabbed her phone and opened the pediatric nurse hotline. Busy. She tried again. Busy. The rain hammered harder against the windows. Emily stood and paced across the apartment while holding Sophie close. Every parental instinct inside her told her something was wrong. Not catastrophic. Not an emergency yet. But wrong. Her phone suddenly vibrated in her hand. Alexander Hayes. She almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, she answered the message. Her fingers moved. Quickly. Fever is higher. I am trying to reach someone. The response came less than 10 seconds later. What is her temperature? 103.1. This time the reply took longer. Long enough for Emily to wonder if she had imagined the entire conversation. Then the screen lit up. Do not wait. She needs to be evaluated. Emily stared at the words. Her heart sank. She already knew that. The problem was getting there. Her old sedan had been in the repair shop for nearly a week. Rideshare prices were surging because of the storm. The nearest urgent care center had closed an hour ago. She typed honestly. I know. I am trying to figure it out. Several seconds passed. Then her phone rang. Not a text. An actual phone call. Emily froze. The caller ID displayed a name she never expected to see. Alexander Hayes. Her pulse quickened. Slowly she answered. Hello. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then a calm, steady voice filled the line. Emily, what is your address? She tightened her grip on the phone. Why? Rain thundered outside. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through the city. Alexander's answer came without hesitation. Because I think you need help right now. Emily looked at Sophie sleeping against her shoulder and felt the weight of the question hanging in the air. Rain rattled against the windows. The apartment seemed smaller with every passing second. I cannot ask you to do that, she said quietly into the phone. Alexander's voice remained calm. You did not ask. Emily closed her eyes. She did not know this man. Not really. He was her employer's employer. A billionaire she had accidentally texted. A stranger whose face appeared on magazine covers. Yet somehow he sounded more concerned than people who had known her for years. Emily, he said gently. What is your address? She hesitated for only a moment before giving it to him. There was silence on the line. Then she heard the faint sound of a car door closing somewhere in the background. Thank you, Alexander said. Stay with Sophie. I am on my way. Before Emily could respond, the call ended. She stared at the phone. Her heart pounded. Surely he did not mean it. Surely he was sending an assistant. A driver. Someone from a service. Billionaires did not leave meetings in the middle of the night to help employees. That only happened in movies. Yet 20 miles away, Alexander Hayes was already stepping into the rain. The cold wind pushed against his coat as he crossed the private parking garage beneath the tower. His driver looked surprised when he approached. Sir, Alexander held out his hand. Give me the keys. I can drive you. Not tonight. The driver handed them over without another question. Minutes later, the black SUV pulled onto the wet streets of Chicago. The windshield wipers moved steadily through the storm. City lights reflected across the pavement in long streaks of gold and white. Alexander drove in silence. His phone rested in the cup holder. The image of Sophie remained open on the screen. Every time he glanced at it, memories surfaced. Claire at 7 years old. Claire laughing despite hospital visits. Claire holding a stuffed rabbit during treatments. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. 15 years had passed since losing her. 15 years of building companies. 15 years of staying busy enough to avoid certain memories. Yet tonight those memories felt as close as the rain striking the windshield. Meanwhile, Emily paced across the apartment with Sophie resting against her shoulder. The fever had not climbed further, but it had not improved either. Every few minutes, she checked her daughter's breathing. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the door. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. She began convincing herself the call had been nothing more than kindness from a distance. A promise made in a moment of emotion. Something people often said, but rarely followed through on. Then headlights swept across the apartment wall. Emily froze. The light disappeared. A car door closed outside. Her pulse quickened. Another sound followed. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Deliberate. Then came a knock at the door. 3 quiet taps. Emily stood motionless. The apartment seemed completely silent. Even the rain felt distant now. Carefully, she carried Sophie to the sofa and tucked the blanket around her. Another knock sounded. Emily walked toward the door. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the lock. She looked through the peephole. For a moment, she could not process what she was seeing. Standing beneath the dim hallway light was Alexander Hayes himself. No assistant. No security team. No driver. Just a tall man in a dark coat, rainwater still glistening on his shoulders after the storm outside. He looked nothing like the polished executive from magazine covers. He simply looked concerned. Deeply concerned. Emily slowly opened the door. Neither of them spoke right away. Alexander's eyes moved past her shoulder toward the sleeping child on the sofa. His expression softened immediately. Then he looked back at Emily and quietly asked, "How quickly can you have Sophie ready to leave?" Emily stared at him for a second longer, still struggling to believe he was actually standing there. Rainwater glistened on the shoulders of his dark coat. The hallway light cast soft shadows across his face. He looked tired, concerned, human, not like the distant executive whose image appeared on financial news channels. Not like a billionaire whose company occupied half the city skyline. Just a man focused entirely on the little girl sleeping 10 feet away. 5 minutes, Emily said quietly. Alexander nodded once. Good. He stepped aside without entering the apartment. Emily hurried back to the sofa and gently woke Sophie. The little girl opened her eyes slowly. Mommy, we are going to see a doctor, sweetheart. Sophie looked exhausted but offered a small nod. Within minutes, Emily had packed a backpack with medication, insurance documents, a stuffed rabbit, and an extra sweater. Her hands moved quickly from habit. This was not the first late-night medical scare, but it was the first time she was not facing one alone. When she returned to the door carrying the backpack, Alexander immediately reached for it. I have it. Emily started to protest, then stopped. She was too tired. Together, they walked down the hallway toward the elevator. Sophie rested in Emily's arms while Alexander carried the bag. The old elevator rattled as it descended. No one spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. The black SUV waited near the curb. Alexander opened the rear passenger door himself. Emily carefully settled Sophie into the seat. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit and leaned against the window. A few moments later, the vehicle pulled away from the apartment building and into the wet Chicago streets. City lights blurred across the glass. Storefronts reflected on the pavement. Traffic was light this late at night. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat while Alexander drove. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Sophie suddenly looked forward from the back seat. "Mommy." "Yes, sweetheart." "Is he your friend?" Emily blinked. Alexander glanced briefly toward the rearview mirror. Sophie pointed at him. "The tall man." Emily felt her cheeks warm. "He is helping us tonight." Sophie considered that answer carefully. Then she smiled weakly. "He seems nice." Alexander surprised both of them by smiling. "Thank you, Sophie." The little girl nodded, apparently satisfied, and settled back against her seat. The simple exchange eased some of the tension inside the vehicle. For the first time that evening, Emily noticed how calm Alexander remained. No impatience, no irritation, no sign that his time was more valuable than anyone else's. The hospital came into view 15 minutes later. Bright lights glowed against the dark sky. As soon as they arrived, Alexander parked near the entrance and helped carry the backpack inside. The emergency pediatric department remained active despite the late hour. Nurses moved through hallways. Phones rang. Monitors beeped softly in distant rooms. Emily approached the reception desk, while Sophie leaned heavily against her side. A nurse immediately noticed the little girl and guided them through the intake process. Within minutes, Sophie was taken for evaluation. Emily finally sat down in a chair near the examination area. The adrenaline that had carried her through the evening began to fade. Exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket. She lowered her face into her hands. Across from her, Alexander remained seated. He had not left. He had not checked his watch. He had not taken a single business call. He simply waited. Several minutes later, a nurse approached carrying paperwork. Emily accepted it automatically and glanced at the forms. Her stomach tightened. Additional testing. Specialist consultation. Observation. More expenses. More bills. More numbers she could not afford. She stared at the page silently. Then a calm voice spoke beside her. "Do not worry about that tonight." Emily looked up. Alexander's expression remained steady. "Tonight," he said quietly, "the only thing that matters is Sophie." At that exact moment, a doctor stepped through the doorway holding a chart and looking directly at them. Silence settled over the waiting area as the doctor approached. Emily immediately stood. Her hands tightened around the paperwork she was still holding. Across from her, Alexander rose as well. The doctor offered a reassuring smile before looking down at the chart. "Sophie's oxygen levels are stable," she said. Emily felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Her fever is elevated because of an infection, but right now we are not seeing signs of anything immediately dangerous." Emily closed her eyes briefly. Relief washed through her so quickly it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you," she whispered. The doctor nodded. "We would like to keep her for observation for a few hours and run additional tests. Given her history, we want to be thorough." Emily agreed immediately. A nurse appeared and guided them toward a private pediatric room. The hallway lights seemed softer here. Children's artwork covered the walls. Somewhere nearby, a television played a quiet cartoon. When they entered the room, Sophie was already resting comfortably in bed beneath a pale blue blanket. The little girl looked tired, but her breathing had become noticeably easier. Emily walked straight to her bedside. Sophie opened her eyes and smiled weakly. "Hi, Mommy." Emily brushed a hand through her daughter's hair. "Hi, sweetheart. Did I scare you?" Emily laughed softly despite the exhaustion. "A little." Sophie glanced past her. "Is the tall man still here?" Alexander stood near the doorway. He smiled. "I am still here." Sophie seemed satisfied by that answer and closed her eyes again. Within minutes, she drifted back to sleep. The room became quiet except for the gentle rhythm of medical equipment and the distant sounds of the hospital at night. Emily finally sat in the chair beside the bed. For the first time since leaving the apartment, she allowed herself to breathe. Really breathe. Across the room, Alexander remained seated near the window overlooking the rain-soaked parking lot. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence did not feel awkward. It felt earned. Eventually, Emily looked over. "You did not have to do any of this." Alexander kept his gaze on the glass. "I know. Most people would have sent a ride." A faint smile appeared. Most people probably would have ignored the message entirely. Emily could not argue with that. She studied him for a moment. Tonight she had seen more of the real Alexander Hayes than she had during 4 years working for his company. No cameras. No interviews. No carefully prepared speeches. Just kindness. Quiet kindness. Why? She finally asked. Alexander's expression changed slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough for her to notice. His eyes lowered toward the floor. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. Years ago, someone I loved spent a lot of time in hospitals. Emily waited. My younger sister. The words seemed heavier than everything else he had said that night. She had respiratory problems for most of her childhood. Emily listened carefully. Something in his voice told her this was not a story he shared often. When I saw Sophie's picture, he continued, I recognized the machine beside her. I recognized the look on your face too. Emily swallowed hard. Alexander looked toward the sleeping child. I remember what it looked like when my mother stayed awake all night worrying. I remember how helpless she felt sometimes. His voice remained calm, but sadness lingered beneath every word. Emily suddenly understood. This had never been about a mistaken text message. It had never been about curiosity. The photograph had awakened something much deeper. Something unfinished. Across the room, Sophie shifted in her sleep and hugged her stuffed rabbit closer. Alexander watched quietly. Then a nurse entered carrying preliminary test results. She glanced between them and smiled warmly. Good news, she said. The first reports are coming back better than we expected. Emily felt tears gather in her eyes. And for the first time that night, she realized that the stranger who had arrived because of a simple mistake no longer felt like a stranger at all. The hours after midnight passed slowly inside the pediatric wing. Rain continued sliding down the hospital windows while most of the city slept. Sophie remained comfortable, her fever gradually beginning to respond to treatment. The steady rise and fall of her breathing brought a sense of peace Emily had not felt in days. She sat beside the bed watching her daughter sleep, occasionally adjusting the blanket whenever it slipped from her shoulders. Across the room, Alexander remained near the window. Several times his phone vibrated with incoming calls and messages. Several times he silenced them without looking. Emily finally noticed. You are ignoring work. Alexander glanced down at the dark screen before setting it aside again. Work will still be there in the morning. Emily shook her head slightly. I do not think many chief executives would say that. A faint smile appeared on his face. Most chief executives do not receive accidental messages from exhausted mothers at 11 o'clock at night. The comment earned the first genuine laugh Emily had experienced all evening. The sound surprised even her. For a moment, the weight of medical bills, long shifts, and endless responsibilities seemed to lift. A nurse entered carrying fresh water and updated charts. She smiled warmly at Sophie before leaving again. The simple kindness reminded Emily how vulnerable she had felt only a few hours earlier. Alone in her apartment, unsure what to do next. Now everything seemed different. Not solved, not magically fixed, just a little less frightening. As the night continued, Emily found herself asking a question that had lingered in her mind. What was she like? Alexander looked over. Your sister. Silence filled the room for several seconds. Then his expression softened. She was fearless. Emily listened carefully. Claire was the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends. A quiet chuckle escaped him. She talked constantly. She laughed at everything. She never cared how difficult things became. His eyes drifted toward the sleeping child. The doctors used to tell her she needed more rest. She would nod politely and then spend the afternoon planning adventures. Emily smiled. She could almost picture the girl he described. She sounds wonderful. Alexander nodded slowly. She was. For the first time, Emily noticed something else. The sadness was still there. 15 years later, it remained. Not overwhelming. Not consuming. Just present. Like a scar carried with dignity. She would have liked Sophie, Emily said quietly. Alexander looked toward the bed again. I think she would have. The room fell silent once more. Around 3 in the morning, Sophie stirred and opened her eyes. Her fever had dropped noticeably. She looked around the room with sleepy confusion before spotting Alexander. You are still here. Alexander smiled. I am. Sophie considered this carefully. Most grown-ups leave when it gets late. Emily laughed softly. Alexander leaned forward slightly. Then I suppose it is a good thing I stayed. Sophie smiled and held up her stuffed rabbit. Mr. Whiskers likes you. Alexander accepted the statement with surprising seriousness. That is excellent news. Sophie giggled before drifting back to sleep. The simple exchange left warmth lingering in the room long after her eyes closed again. As dawn slowly approached, pale light began creeping across the horizon beyond the hospital windows. The storm had finally passed. The city below looked washed clean. A doctor entered shortly after sunrise carrying updated test results. She reviewed the chart carefully before looking up with an encouraging smile. The infection appears manageable, and Sophie's numbers look much better this morning. Emily felt relief flood through her chest. Really? The doctor nodded. There will be follow-up appointments and additional evaluations, but she is doing well. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. Gratitude nearly overwhelmed her. When she opened them again, she found Alexander quietly watching the sunrise through the window. Neither of them realized that before the day ended, a decision made inside that hospital room would change far more lives than their own. 3 days later, Sophie was back home. The fever was gone. Her energy had returned little by little. The small apartment felt brighter somehow. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Cartoons played softly in the background. For the first time in weeks, Emily watched her daughter laugh without worrying about the next cough or the next sleepless night. Yet life had not suddenly become easy. Medical appointments still filled the calendar. Bills still waited on the kitchen counter. Responsibilities still arrived every morning before sunrise. But something inside Emily had changed. She no longer felt completely alone. Over the following weeks, Alexander checked in regularly. Never in a way that felt intrusive. Never in a way that crossed boundaries. Sometimes it was a simple message asking how Sophie was feeling. Sometimes it was information about a specialist he had researched. Sometimes it was nothing more than a reminder to take care of herself too. Emily found herself looking forward to those conversations. One afternoon, nearly a month after the hospital visit, Alexander sat alone in his office overlooking downtown Chicago. The city stretched for miles beneath the glass walls. Meetings filled his calendar. Investors waited for decisions. Yet his attention rested on a folder sitting open across his desk. Inside were reports about pediatric respiratory care throughout Illinois. Numbers, statistics, waiting lists, families struggling to afford treatment, children missing appointments because transportation costs were too high. Alexander stared at the pages for a long time. Then he thought about Claire. He thought about Sophie. He thought about how close one exhausted mother had come to facing that frightening night completely alone. By the end of the week, a new project quietly appeared on his schedule. No press release, no interviews, no media campaign, just meetings with doctors, hospital administrators, and community leaders. The project grew rapidly. Specialists joined the discussions. Funding was approved. Plans expanded. Even Alexander's executive team struggled to understand why this particular initiative mattered so much to him. Only a handful of people knew the real reason. Months later, Emily received an unexpected phone call while finishing a shift at the cafe. The caller invited her to attend the opening ceremony of a new pediatric support foundation. At first, she assumed there had been a mistake. Then she heard the name, the Sophie Carter Children's Respiratory Care Initiative. Emily nearly dropped the phone. That evening, she drove to the address provided in the invitation. The event occupied a beautiful new medical outreach center connected to Mercy Children's Hospital. Families filled the lobby. Nurses greeted children. Volunteers distributed information packets. Hope seemed to live inside every hallway. Sophie walked beside her mother, holding Mr. Whiskers tightly against her chest. "Mommy," she whispered, "why is my name on the sign?" Emily smiled through tears she could barely contain. "I think someone wanted people to remember your story." Across the room, Alexander stood near the stage speaking quietly with physicians and hospital staff. When he saw them arrive, his expression softened immediately. Sophie ran forward first. "Mr. Alexander." Several people turned in surprise as one of the most powerful executives in the state knelt to greet a 6-year-old girl carrying a stuffed rabbit. Alexander smiled. "You look much stronger." Sophie nodded proudly. "I am." The ceremony began shortly afterward. Doctors spoke about access to care. Families shared personal experiences. Then Alexander stepped onto the stage. The room grew silent. Hundreds of people watched. Cameras waited. Yet his gaze found Emily and Sophie almost immediately. People often ask what inspires meaningful change, he began. They expect complicated answers. They expect business strategies or market research. He paused briefly. Sometimes the answer is much simpler. The audience listened carefully. Sometimes change begins when you decide not to ignore someone who needs help. His eyes moved towards Sophie. This initiative exists because every child deserves a chance to breathe easier. Every parent deserves support. And every difficult night should end with hope. The room erupted into applause. Emily looked around at the families, the children, the doctors, and the nurses. Then she looked back at Alexander. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Both understood the truth. None of this would have happened without one small mistake on an ordinary night. A message sent to the wrong person had somehow reached exactly the right one. 1 year later, the city looked different to Emily Carter. Not because the skyline had changed. Not because the streets were new. But because hope had quietly taken root in places where fear once lived. On a bright spring morning, she stood outside Sophie's elementary school, watching her daughter race across the playground with friends. Laughter filled the air. The little girl who had once spent nights struggling through treatments now ran freely beneath a clear blue sky. Emily smiled as Sophie waved enthusiastically from the swings. Some days that simple sight still felt like a miracle. Life was not perfect. There were still bills. There were still difficult days. But the constant fear that had once followed her everywhere was gone. Much of that change had started on a rainy night with a single message sent by mistake. Her phone buzzed softly. A familiar name appeared on the screen. Alexander. Emily answered with a smile already forming. Good morning. Good morning, Alexander replied. Are you ready? Emily looked toward the school entrance where Sophie was already gathering her backpack. We will be there in 20 minutes. Perfect. The call ended. A short drive later, Emily and Sophie arrived at the new headquarters of the Sophie Carter Children's Respiratory Care Initiative. The building stood beside Mercy Children's Hospital, welcoming families from across the state. Parents entered carrying toddlers. Volunteers greeted visitors. Nurses guided families through the doors. Everywhere Emily looked, she saw something powerful. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when people realize they do not have to face everything alone. Inside the main lobby, a large photograph displayed the foundation's first year of impact. Thousands of children had received support. Hundreds of families had gained access to specialists. Waiting lists had shortened. Resources had expanded. What began as one small act of kindness had become something far larger than anyone imagined. Sophie stared proudly at the display. Mommy, look. Emily followed her daughter's finger. Beneath the photograph was a simple plaque. It read, "One child inspired a mission. One mother inspired hope." Sophie looked up. That is us. Emily felt tears gather in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart. Before she could say more, a familiar voice spoke from behind them. There you are. They turned to see Alexander walking toward them. Sophie immediately ran forward and wrapped her arms around him. Alexander laughed and lifted her into a hug. You are getting taller every time I see you. That is because I am 6 now, Sophie informed him seriously. Almost 7. My mistake. Emily watched them together and shook her head with a smile. Over the past year, Alexander had become part of their lives in the most unexpected way. Not as a rescuer. Not as a billionaire. Simply as someone who showed up when it mattered and never stopped showing up afterward. Later that afternoon, a gathering was held for families, doctors, and community leaders. As the event came to a close, Alexander stood before the audience one final time. The room quieted. He looked across the crowd. Then his eyes found Emily and Sophie. A year ago, he began, I was sitting in a meeting focused on numbers, projections, and business decisions. I thought those things were the most important parts of my day. He paused briefly. Then a message appeared on my phone. Soft laughter moved through the audience. Alexander smiled. What happened afterward reminded me of something I had forgotten. Success means very little if it only serves yourself. The room remained silent, listening. Sometimes the most important opportunities in life arrive disguised as interruptions. Sometimes they appear when we least expect them. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is deciding to care. When the applause finally faded, Emily looked around the room once more. At the families. At the children. At the hope that now filled the building. Then she looked toward Alexander. He could have ignored that message. He could have dismissed it. He could have chosen convenience. Instead, he chose kindness. And because of that choice, countless lives had changed forever. As sunlight poured through the lobby windows and Sophie laughed beside them, Emily realized something extraordinary. The message had gone to the wrong number, but somehow, it had reached exactly the right heart.